And now, ladies and gentlemen, Binnall of America Audio, with your host, Tim Binnall.
Hello out there, my friends. This is Tim Binnall of BinnallofAmerica.com with another edition of Binnall of America Audio, Season 2. It is December 9th, 2006, and this week our guest is Bill Ryan, creator of SERPO.org, the website that chronicles the infamous Project SERPO story, which burst onto the scene in Esoterica late last year and has become one of the big stories over the last 12 months. As I alluded to last week, I kind of poo-pooed the SERPO story when it first broke. I didn't put much credence into it. I was tempted to delve into it on Binnall of America Audio Season 1, but I said, let's give it a year and see how it all shakes out, and then we'll be able to really get a good look at what the SERPO story is all about. That's pretty much what we're doing here this week with Bill Ryan. As I said, he's the creator of SERPO.org. He has been on the front lines of the SERPO story since it began. And we're going to be talking about just that, how it all began, the reaction to the SERPO story, and its amazing explosion onto the scene in Esoterica. Going chronologically from the very beginning, we follow all the twists and turns of the SERPO story. We are not going to be wasting your time with what the culture of the aliens is and what kind of games they play on their little planet SERPO. No, we're going to be looking at the story behind the story, and hopefully we can glean some answers as to how this esoteric phenomenon came about. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Bill Ryan, let me give a little bit of background on him. Bill Ryan has a BSc in mathematics with physics and psychology from Bristol University in the UK, and followed this with a brief stint in teaching. For the last 27 years, he has been a management consultant specializing in personal and team development, leadership training, and executive coaching. Major long-term clients have included BAE Systems Limited, formerly British Aerospace, Hewlett-Packard, and PricewaterhouseCoopers. In November of 2005, he inaugurated the Project SERPO website, the report of an alleged disclosure in stages of a U.S. alien exchange program claimed to have taken place over 40 years ago. While he had been interested in UFOs, free energy research, and alternative medicine, he is trained as a kinesiologist for over 30 years. His first contact with the UFO community at large occurred after establishing the SERPO website. His websites are SERPO.org and ProjectCamelot.org. Without any further ado, let's rock and roll. This interview was recorded on October 26, 2006. Bill Ryan on Binnall of America Audio, Season 2.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of Binnall of America Audio. I want to welcome as my guest Bill Ryan. He is the man behind SERPO.org, the website, and also ProjectCamelot.org, which is a website that features video interviews with some big names in Esoterica. Bill was primarily responsible for collecting the infamous SERPO postings by Anonymous that began about 1 year ago. We're about a week away from the 1 year anniversary of SERPO, the beginnings of SERPO. And a lot of people are talking about SERPO. It's been talked about big all the last year, and a lot of people wanted me to get a SERPO guest on. I want to take my time, let this story percolate a little bit, and now that we're at the 1 year anniversary, I think we can look back on the past year and discuss not only SERPO, the story that is SERPO, but also the story behind the story. How did SERPO come about? How did it become this big phenomenon that everybody was talking about throughout all of 2006? We're going to cover all that and tons more here tonight with Bill Ryan. Bill, welcome to the show.
Tim, thank you for talking to me. It's a great pleasure to be here.
No problem. I'm really excited to talk to you. I've been following this SERPO story as much as I can over the past year, and I'm really excited about digging into this with you. Let's start out first with your bio, the background, the basic background information. What was your life like before you started into this, and what brought you interested in the UFO phenomenon right up until the SERPO story started?
I'm tempted to make a joke out of that and say, well, before all this, my life was very quiet. Actually, I suppose in terms of ufology, I consider myself, up until certainly the SERPO releases started coming forward, and I was the Joe Nobody in the audience, so to speak, who put out my hand and volunteered to build a website for that. Up until then, I was a management consultant specializing in team building, personal development, leadership training, that kind of stuff. I work with people, and so I'm used to talking in front of audiences of people, which is how come I'm happy to be talking to you on the phone here in this interview for as long as you want to. I'm a mountaineer, so I enjoy taking measured risks, and I don't. I enjoy adventure, and I enjoy activity, and I enjoy challenge, and I guess that this is something which my involvement in SERPO has brought me in some small measure. I've done a little bit of kind of presentational work in my work with companies and corporations. I used to put together material for executives to consider proposals, that kind of stuff. And so I know a little bit about presenting information. Now, of course, many other of your listeners will as well. So, I mean, it's not an exclusive area. But it was because I've been interested in what you call esoteria, I guess, for ever since I was a kid. I was interested in the unexplained.
Yeah.
Sure, in the unexplained. Some people call it the paranormal, and I've always been interested in things that just kind of push the boundaries of established knowledge, push the boundaries of science, and nothing gets me more interested than a really good mystery with a lot of question marks after it. And SERPO was one of those, and I actually think not only did it sort of dare I say it, touched something within me, but it touched something within an awful lot of people.
Yeah.
And you remarked a few moments ago about how it really got a lot of people buzzing in 2006, and that's really been the case. And it's really fascinating just to explore how come this has caught the imagination so much. Yeah. One reason why I think it's caught the imagination is because the story itself is contentious. And if you dive into the details of the releases, which I have just posted verbatim, I take no responsibility for the content of the website. I do take responsibility for the presentation to some degree. But in some cases, the presentation is poor because I was asked to present things exactly as they were received, errors and all, and in some cases it makes it very hard to read. So let me back up on what I was saying then. The content is contentious, and I think this is one reason why it's stirred up all kinds of debate. And the debate has been very spirited. The positions which people have occupied in debate have sometimes been quite extreme. People have got very angry about this, saying it's a hoax and saying that I'm a hoaxer and I've invented it all myself. I mean, this is nonsense. I haven't at all. I'm just a reporter. One of the factors to consider when debating the veracity of the story is the interesting twist which I like to put, that if somebody was inventing this, they would probably have done a better job. And we can dive into that later about the various anomalies in the story and how come some people don't like the data. Yeah. I think it's also struck a chord because there's something about the extraordinary excitement. It's like supposing it was true. The idea of humankind actually venturing out, not just beyond, our small reach to the moon, but beyond this solar system and 40 light years on to another star system entirely. It's rather like the way that the old worlders must have felt about the voyage of Columbus, or even before that, the voyage of Leif Erikson across the Atlantic, when they didn't know where they were going. They didn't know if there was anything there. They didn't know they'd ever come back. They didn't know what they'd find. Going from the old world to the new world and really reaching out. And of course, this is it's a sort of modern archetype which has caught the imagination in many of our modern science fiction myths.
Yeah.
And I use the word myth in the true sense of the word, meaning a myth is a story that contains an important truth or contains important elements for us to consider, which can help us which can help us consider and understand our nature as human beings in the world, Yeah. And there's a real myth here about what it takes to make contact with an alien species and to travel to their home planet and to survive that journey and then to come back. All of this many of the great myths which we have enjoyed. In modern times, we enjoyed Lord of the Rings. Thousands of years ago, they enjoyed Homer's The Odyssey and the Iliad. And these are voyages, and they're journeys faced with danger and difficulty and confusion and an uncertain outcome. And all of this is told here in a modern way. And in the messages which I've received on the website, I've had things that have just blown me away completely. I've had elderly people, saying, "God bless you. I never thought I would hear this information in my lifetime. Thank you so much."
Wow.
And it's almost like it doesn't really matter if it's true. Now, I say that from one particular point of view. That's not actually my own position, but it's almost as if some people were thinking, I don't even mind whether it's true or not. It's just an incredible story, and it's really grabbed me, my imagination. And this is what other people have been saying. Yeah. And then, of course, there's a reverse reaction to that. Some people have come very angry because they say, this isn't true. How can you put this stuff on the net? This is irresponsible. And as you said right at the beginning, I do share your view. My view is that this is not all true. I don't think it can be. There are too many anomalies. And then, of course, we can have some fun discussing about whether or not those anomalies are deliberately inserted or have accidentally found their way in there, or whether it's a mixture of both.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of muddy bathwater, so to speak, but if there's a baby in there, we mustn't throw it out. And This is my position. I was asked a while back if I was an advocate of the story, and my position is that I'm not an advocate of the story. I'm an advocate of people being willing to suspend their disbelief for long enough to consider whether the story might have merit. And I think the story does have merit, because for a couple of decades now, as some of your listeners may remember if they've been studying the subject for a little while, there have been rumors circulating about an exchange program really for quite a long time.
Yeah.
Linda Howe has reported it. Bill Hamilton has reported it. John Lear has reported it. Robert Ebenegger reported it. Bill Cooper talked about 16 people going on an exchange program. Linda Howe said there were only 3. Maybe these details don't matter, but if you consider the possibility of alien contact, which many of your listeners will accept, probably otherwise they wouldn't be listening.
Yeah.
And if we assume from there that contact and communication has been established, which is a pretty reasonable bet over a 50-year period, those are the 2 huge assumptions. And then after that, it's a much smaller leap of the imagination to think that, well, it's only natural. The next step from that is that those guys would have invited us back home to their place.
Exactly. Now, for the people who are new to this whole thing and haven't heard the SERPO story, let's talk about the actual SERPO story, like what the story was. It was an exchange program. Purportedly, the SERPO story as we know it, that came out starting last November, was an exchange program that went on between the U.S. and a group of aliens from the planet known as SERPO. Tell me, go in depth on that. Let's give the story for people who haven't even heard from the beginning.
Okay. I'll give the headlines first as best I can.
Okay.
The story was that in 1965, after contact had been made with the same group of aliens that crashed at Roswell, one of whom survived, the story was that 12 American astronauts went on a trip to their home planet, which is the 4th planet of Zeta Reticuli 2, I believe. That's a binary star system which is 40 light years away, and Zeta Reticuli will probably be well known to many of your listeners. And they stayed there for 13 years. 8 of them returned. 2 of them died somewhere along the way, and 2 of them, most interestingly, decided to stay and were not ordered to return. That's the smallest nutshell that the story can be crammed into, I believe.
Yeah.
And then after that, as we mentioned a little earlier, things become a little bit contentious with the details of the story, their internal consistencies, how this could have happened, and so on and so forth.
Okay. Now let's sort of back up for that and talk about how the story actually burst on the scene. It started on a email mailing list that was run by one Victor Martinez, correct?
Victor Martinez, that's right. Victor Martinez runs it's kind of like a news list that he sends out to a group of people on his mailing list, items of interest or information to do with ufology and related subjects.
Yes.
And last November, he had about 130 people on his list. I was one of them. I actually arrived on that list completely by accident, and I was in the company of people who were of far greater stature than myself. One of the things that made his list a little different from most email discussion lists was that there were many UFO researchers, intelligence officers, military personnel. It was quite a who's who, I suppose, of people in the ufology and intelligence and military community who are interested in those things at that time. And, and he received a message from an anonymous source that was apparently one of a small group of people from the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, who were releasing this information. And he got this information by email on the 1st of November last year, and he streamed it to his list on the 2nd of November. And the way this list operates is that it's very simple. It's as simple as it can get. What he does is he simply copies everything on an open CC to all the email addresses which he has.
Yeah.
And then if anyone wants to reply or make a comment, then they just hit reply all, and then the discussion goes backwards and forwards like that. Mm-hmm. And as soon as Victor had streamed this to what at that point was 130-odd people, there was a very great deal of interest from quite a few names who your listeners, I think, would recognize. There are people like, I'm trying to think who responded early at that time. We had Hal Puthoff, we had Bruce Maccabee, we had Christopher Green, Kit Green, who used to run the Weird Desk at the CIA. We had Bob Collins. We had all sorts of people who jumped in. We had Bill Hamilton. All jumped into this debate, all knocking this story around about whether it was true or not, and so on and so forth, and what it was all about. And Victor, bless him, is not very computer literate. The extent of his system was web TV, and some of your listeners may know that web TV is not a sophisticated system. It doesn't have a lot of data storage capacity, for example.
Yeah.
And after about 6 or 7 of these fairly long messages had come in and were being streamed to the list by Victor, it became, I think, 2 things became apparent and were actually being discussed on the list. One was that there should be some way of archiving all this information, and another was that more people other than this 130 should be able to hear about it rather than just in this little closed group. And I had some time on my hands, and as I said a little earlier, I was just the guy in the audience who stuck my hand up and said, well, okay, I'll do that. I'll build a website. I don't mind. And Victor said, thank you very much. That's wonderful. And I got stuck into that. And if my guardian angel had flown in through the window and said, you know what, in 11 and a half months from now, you'll still be talking about this on the radio to thousands of people who are still curious about this story, I just would not have believed them. I never even gave it a thought that my own involvement would be such that with Victor not wanting to talk publicly to anybody about this, simply because he's an employed English teacher and he's a very private man in that respect.
Yeah.
There's nobody else for people to talk to about the story because everybody else is behind the black curtain.
Exactly.
And so everyone's been phoning me, saying, what do you think about the story and can you represent it? And I've kind of become a spokesperson.
Exactly, yeah.
Which I don't mind at all. It's not what I signed up for, but I'm very happy to do it. And as I said a little earlier, as long as people understand I'm the representative of the story, but I'm not a proponent of the story. I think there's truth there. I think it's fascinating. I think there are important things in there. I think there are important things to think about, but I'm not going around pushing the story saying, look, you better believe this because it's all true, and get into fights with people, because that's not what I'm here to do. It's just really to get people thinking, and I think that is exactly what's happened, and this is why so many people, even right now, 12 months later, will be tuning into your show to hear about it.
Oh, I'm sure. And now, during that first month or so of the SERPO story, that's when it really sort of exploded within the mailing list there. I wanted to ask about two people, and throughout this interview tonight, I should point out that I'm referencing the PDF file that can be found at SERPO.org that's a collection of the SERPO postings. Right. So if I reference something, the listeners can go there, they can download the PDF file, and they'll know what I'm talking about. In that first month, when the SERPO story exploded, I found this pretty interesting. Maybe you can talk about this person as much as you can, or at least their role in the story. Right after the initial anonymous posting, there's a posting from Gene Laskowski, who, and this may win someone an esoteric trivia contest someday. Gene Laskowski was actually, I noticed, and was very surprised to see that he was the man who dropped the SERPO name first. It wasn't the first anonymous poster. It was Gene Laskowski responding and saying, this is called SERPO. Can you talk a little bit about that posting, who this Gene Laskowski is, and, it sounded like he was just as knowledgeable about it as the original anonymous post.
That's right, and there's another player in there as well who also claimed a great deal of knowledge, and this was Paul McGovern.
Yep, he was next on my list here.
Yeah. Gene Laskowski, his real name is Gene Lakes, and I am told, I've never spoken to him, I've never even corresponded with him. He's a very shadowy figure behind the scenes. When I say shadowy, I don't mean that in any kind of disparaging way. I just mean that nobody knows anything about him. But I am told by people who do claim to know him well, people like Bob Collins, who wrote the book Exempt from Disclosure, where I believe Gene Laskowski is also mentioned. They say that he was the ex-head of security at Area 51, and he's that puts him, I guess, close to the heavyweight division of intelligence officers.
Yeah.
Somebody who has that kind of responsibility probably knows quite a lot about quite a lot of things.
Exactly.
What a lot of people have speculated, and I would agree with them, is that when this anonymous source piped up, and then immediately after that, Gene, well, I'm actually going to call him Gene Lakes simply because it's easier to say, and that's his real name. Gene Lakes and Paul McGovern both piped up instantly with details of the story, and you're absolutely correct that there were some things which either Paul or Gene mentioned first and were then kind of subsumed into the totality of the SERPO story, as if they had come from the anonymous source. For example, Paul McGovern was the first person to mention the existence of the 3,000-page report, and then after that, Anonymous carried on talking about it as if he had mentioned it. And so there's a lot of kind of what I could call circumstantial forensic evidence, if you like, in those early stages, to suggest that Mr. Anonymous and Gene Lakes and Paul McGovern were actually releasing this information in harness.
Yeah.
That they knew about this and were acting together and were acting in league, and they were communicating with each other behind the scenes. I think that's pretty well assumed by most people who've been following the story closely.
Okay. And what can you tell us about Paul McGovern? You gave us some pretty good information about Gene Lake there. What do you know about Paul McGovern?
I know very little about Paul McGovern. He works for the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is where this whole release is supposed to have come from. Mm-hmm. We knew at an early stage because Victor told us, because he had been told this in private messages from the anonymous source, that this all came from a group of 6 DIA personnel, 3 of whom were employed and 3 of whom were retired. And later on, Victor actually stated that 85% of the information came from his anonymous source.
Yeah.
15% came from from Paul McGovern, 13% came from Paul McGovern, and the occasional 2% came from Jean Lakes. And Victor seems to have worked that out. I never saw any of the original messages, and I know that Victor did some editing and some cutting and pasting because Victor was concerned about the presentation of the material, and at heart he's an editor. And so the original messages from these people, and this is something that's had one or two folks tearing their hair out, they've all been deleted by the web TV system because Victor never kept them. And I remember telling Hal Puthoff this, who, as you may know, is a scientist. He's one of the world's greatest scientists, really. And when I told him that we had no source data, he couldn't. He's like, "What? You've got no raw data? You mean I've got nothing that I can do? I can subject to scientific scrutiny?" And I said, "No, it's all gone. Because for Victor, the important thing was the message and the presentation."
Yeah.
And so there we're starting to look into the story behind the story.
Yeah. And now also in this first month, there's 1/4 additional post that I found kind of interesting, and that was titled as being from an Anonymous 2. I didn't see any other Anonymous 2 posters in the PDF file of all the postings. So what was the story with this all of a sudden additional person that came in and added their voice and then bailed out on the whole thing?
Well, I have absolutely no idea. I mean, he was only called Anonymous 2 by Victor.
Okay.
His name was provided to Victor, and Victor honored his request to keep his identity confidential, and so he called him Anonymous 2.
Okay.
I don't actually know who that was, and Victor has never told me, and I mean, I've never asked him. Mm-hmm. The initial Anonymous source, he did actually give his name, which is a pseudonym, but Victor, to be on the safe side, called him Anonymous, which has been this kind of this word that has kind of threaded itself through these SERPO releases and almost acquired a kind of an extraordinary mystical meaning in its own right, Mm-hmm. But in that first release, and in fact in all the other releases that Victor received, it came from somebody called Sylvester McCoglin. And Sylvester McCoglin itself is a pseudonym. And what is very interesting there is that very recently it was discovered that Sylvester and McCoglin were two of a particular individual's ancestors' names. I think one was the grandfather and one was the grandmother, or something like that. I can't quite remember the details. And this person was an elderly individual with intelligence connections who was on Victor's list for a while, and then as soon as I piped up, not mentioning this person's name, but saying that there was an individual who had the words Sylvester and McCoglin in his ancestors' names, this individual very quietly asked himself to be removed from Victor's list, and of course he was.
Uh-oh.
And so it becomes reasonably clear that there are a number of people who are behind this and who are involved in this and who have a lot of knowledge.
Yeah.
I think that's the most important thing to state. This is not a kid in a basement making it all up. Mm-hmm. There's something going on here, and if it's a hoax, it's a well-organized hoax, or it's a hoax which has got a lot of people's complicity in it. Mm-hmm. And the paradox that then is attached to that is that if it's a hoax with which a lot of people have put their shoulder to and have decided to get together to and perpetrate, then they really haven't done a very good job in making it a convincing hoax, because the whole thing is a shot full of holes as a Swiss cheese. Yeah. And you can go to any bookstore and look at the science fiction story, the science fiction section, and find stories written by experienced science fiction writers with well-crafted, well-created worlds which are consistent in their physics and their presentation, in every aspect of what it takes to make a convincing world. It's not hard to do. And you would have thought that with that if these intelligence people were inventing something like this, the first thing that they would have easy access to scientists who would have said, well, actually, you have to make these numbers work because this is going out to astrophysicists, and they're going to immediately spot if, for instance, the astronomical measurements don't seem to correspond to Kepler's orbital laws.
Yeah.
And yet, the very fact that the thing was shot full of holes, to some people, including myself, it suggests that this was not a hoax because they would have made a better job of it. Mm-hmm. To other people, for them, it's evidence that actually what's happening here is that this is some kind of a sociological experiment on the entire UFO community just to see how much nonsense they would take, just to see how credible and credulous they are.
Yeah.
I don't believe that because I think there would be easier ways of doing it. There's something going on here that seems to me to be important. And that was confirmed for me in the form of an email that I received from another anonymous source that came to me directly through the SERPO website contact form from Los Alamos National Laboratories. Mm-hmm. And I replied straight back to this individual that the email bounced and it wasn't a proper email address because on the contact form you can put in any old email address.
Yeah.
Which, that was the idea of the contact form, so that people could contact me anonymously, mm-hmm. of which more later. But this particular individual said very simply, they said, the SERPO information is 80% true and contains 20% fiction. This is part of a controlled release of information by the U.S. government. Period. That's what it said. And I stared at that for quite a long time. And it just rang true. Now, I can't prove that that wasn't a kid in the basement.
Yeah.
But I think if it was a kid in the basement, they would have elaborated at great length. This was a one-liner.
Yeah.
It's the kind of thing that you would get from a deep throat. Just give you a snippet of information and then walk away. Mm-hmm. And I've actually had quite a few of those, none of which offer any substantial proof to a skeptic. But they all point to the fact that there's something going on here which contains truth and should be taken seriously. I've even had people email me anonymously saying, this is incredible information. Where did you get it all from? I don't believe you can be guessing because you've got half of it right, and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And then I get back to them, and then there's nobody there. So it's all been a prolonged, protracted tease, and as I said just a moment ago, there's no evidence at all to prove that there's anything in the story. But there's a huge amount of circumstantial evidence that, choose your metaphor, that there's a baby in the bathwater or that there's fire somewhere behind all the smoke. There's a lot of smoke, but there does seem to be something happening. And to go right back to where we started, this is what I think has caught the public's interest.
Yeah. Now, let's talk about some of the key events that went on in the second month of the SERPO story as it unfolded. One of the points I think that you said it was one of the more infamous moments during this whole SERPO thing was in a posting on December 8th, 2005, where Anonymous said that he had 5 pictures and he was going to roll them out for everybody to see. And, of course, those pictures never surfaced. Talk about that posting, that promise, and what that sort of effect that had on the SERPO story.
Yeah, well, right. I had this feeling that you were going to bring that up. That certainly is infamous. And I have since berated Victor for actually mentioning that because it was a little silly. And, I mean, I don't mean any criticism of him personally at all. Mm-hmm. And he's taken this on the chin so many times since then.
Oh, I'm sure.
But it's much better to under-promise and over-deliver the other way around. And this was a huge over-promise with no delivery whatsoever.
Yeah.
And of course, in many people's eyes, that was the nail in the coffin for the fact that the whole thing was a load of nonsense. Because of course these photos don't exist. Of course they're never going to appear, and you fell for it, and blah blah blah. I've since berated myself for reporting what otherwise would only have been known among a very small group of people. But I'd kind of made this commitment to everyone that I would report everything that Victor posted, just as sort of a dumb messenger. And that's what I did. And that's why I stated it on the website, because he stated it in his posting. And maybe that was naive, but it certainly generated a huge amount of discussion about the photos and why they haven't appeared, and do they exist, and could they exist? And jumping forwards, if you don't mind, then
that's fine.
Some of your listeners will be aware that I experienced in one of the most extraordinary 20 minutes of my life. I experienced a cloak and dagger episode where I met with an intelligence officer in a hotel room and was shown 5 photographs. I was not permitted to copy them, and I wasn't permitted to keep them. And I've described them on the website. They're described in some detail in the section which is called Updates, which is, I call it that because it's my personal update rather than a formal information release, in the section on SERPO.org called Updates.
Mm-hmm.
Long piece which I wrote on the 7th of July where I described this whole thing. And to cut that a little bit short, there were 3 photographs that really weren't worth anything at all. There was one that looked like it could have been, there's some weird-shaped rocks that were in a desert that could have been on this planet,
Yeah.
And the 5th photograph took my breath away, because what it depicted was a desert scene. It's a desert landscape taken from a slightly elevated viewpoint, like a sand dune or a low hill or something, with dark storm clouds in the sky, and then on the horizon there were 2 suns setting. And it looked like the kind of thing that you would take a photograph of if you happened to be there and you happened to have a camera. You just take the shot.
Yeah.
It was just a stunning landscape. And all I can say is that it looked real. Now, no one else can offer opinion on that, because I haven't seen the damn things. And it really took my breath away. I've thought about that picture many, many times since then, and I would love to see it again. The other 4 weren't really worth anything, but that one really, really did it for me. And it opens up another area of the story, if once again you'll allow me just to jump about.
Go ahead.
Just a small bit, because it connects directly with this photograph issue.
Okay.
So one of the criticisms of the story is that, according to our own astronomical observations, Zeta Reticuli is what's known as a distant binary, which means that the 2 stars are in a gravitational, are permanently gravitationally connected with each other. But actually, they're quite a long way apart from each other. They're 1/10 of the light year apart. And if we were in a planet orbiting one of their suns, the other sun would just be a little bright speck in the sky. We wouldn't see, 2 similar-sized suns in the sky. You'd only see that if the binary star was called what's called a close binary. And a lot of people have got upset and have been skeptical of the story for that very reason, that this is at odds with what we seem to know about Zeta Reticuli.
Yeah.
And from then, you just make a little leap and you say, well, look, maybe it wasn't Zeta Reticuli at all. Maybe that's part of the 20% fiction. Maybe that's part of the disinformation.
Yeah.
Would fit perfectly if it was Alpha Centauri, for example, if we were looking at Alpha Centauri and Proxima Centauri, because they are a close binary. They're only 4 light years away. And then that jumps on to the other area of debate, which is, well, if it was Zeta Reticuli, if it wasn't Zeta Reticuli, why were we told that it was? Is this some kind of a disinformation ploy? Because the Ebens, which are the aliens that live on this supposed planet SERPO, that the Ebens the Ebens are presented as kind of warm, fuzzy, friendly, soccer-playing mom and pop aliens, as John Deere likes to call them, a little disparagingly. And a lot of people think this is a load of nonsense. This is not what the Greys are like. The Greys are more sinister. The Greys abduct us. The Greys give us frightening experiences, and they stick implants up our nose, and they do things like this. And they do all kinds of things that the U.S. government doesn't want us to know about. So what a wonderful way to present us with this kind of friendly, E.T. movie type scenario, which might be a cover for something completely different.
Yeah.
But once again, I know this wasn't where this question started, but it's kind of where it all goes.
Yeah.
Where you started was talking to me about these photographs, which never appeared, and of course, for some, that's when they lost interest in the story.
Yeah, I think it really hurt the story a lot. Now, I want to ask you about also. I personally want to jump ahead now. This is going to be confusing at times, I'm sure, because we're trying to work in the chronology here, but this story, we're trying to follow each strand as well. Now, I know there were some purported photos that surfaced around April or so. One of the writers for Binnall of America, Leslie, is on the Victor Martinez list, and she received the pictures, but they quickly didn't last very long, I guess, because they were pretty bogus pictures. What do you know about this story?
There was a huge misunderstanding. I'm trying to remember exactly what happened there.
Okay.
Victor sometimes likes to make jokes, and also sometimes he just passes things on saying, hey, look, I was given this picture, and so on and so forth. I think there was one picture that he circulated, which rather obviously had the word Andy in the corner. Which apparently had been floating around the internet for quite a long time, and basically was a guy in a Halloween mask. And I think Victor, bless him, did think for a moment that was a real photograph. And once again, he sent it out to his list before he had time to check anything out. These were not meant to be the fabled photographs.
Yeah.
There's another incident where I was given a photograph that I was told was either EBE1 or very similar to EBE1. And then a lot of people jumped on me saying, look, this has been on the internet forever, and so on and so forth. And clearly it was a model. Comparing it with other pictures, you could actually see where it was just a bust, and it only had, below the forearm, it didn't have any arms, and so on and so forth. It was just like a classical bust of an alien. But before I published that image myself, being very clear to say that this was a purported image of EBE1, I did run it past this character who, wearing my other hat, which is one of the two people involved in Project Camelot, that we might have time to talk about later.
Oh, we'll definitely talk about that.
We were in touch with this guy called Mr. X, and the connection between Mr. X and SERPO was that he got in touch with me via the SERPO website contact form. He didn't have anything to say about SERPO. He said he'd never heard of an exchange program, or he didn't know anything about it. But he did have the astonishing experience when he was a young man in the mid-'80s, working for a 6-month period as a glorified classified file clerk, handling top-secret documents and films and photographs and even alien artifacts, filing and categorizing these things from big bags that were brought in for him to open under armed guard. It was an extraordinary scenario. And I ran this photograph past him, and he said, yeah. He said, I saw 2 different kinds of aliens in the course of my work, and he said, that was definitely one of them. He said, it could even be him. And so I thought, well, that's good enough for me. I'm going to say that this is a purported photograph of EB1. But at no point were these meant to be the SERPO photographs. They were just kind of images that emerged somewhere along the way when we were all going along this kind of slightly complicated ride together.
Definitely. Well, I wanted to clear that up. I wanted to bring that up. I should give kudos to BinnallofAmerica.com's Leslie. She's the one who she's been following the SERPO story closer than I could possibly imagine for the last year. So she had written about it at BinnallofAmerica.com, and I wanted to ask about that because that column actually generated a lot of interest in and of itself. So
okay, well,
I'm glad we talked.
If she's listening to this now, I invite her to get in touch with me directly. Maybe we can straighten some things out, and I'll be as straight as I possibly can be.
Excellent. Well, I'm sure she's going to enjoy the interview. Why don't you let's flesh out a little bit about this private meeting before we move on. It wasn't just a meeting to discuss for the guy just to hand you the pictures and then he just sat there. Well, what did he have to say, and how did it come about in the first place? Maybe I can find out some new information here.
Okay. There isn't really any new information to be told. There are things obviously about that which I'm not at liberty to say.
Yeah.
I've been asked clearly, not to reveal the man's identity or the location or the time or anything like that, which makes it all a bit of a cloak and dagger thing.
Yeah.
I was given to understand that I would shortly be receiving these photographs to post, and the impression which I got is that this man would then contact me later saying, okay, here they are, in electronic form so that you can post them to the net and you can do all this. And then that never came, and I never heard from that person again. It's just one of the many false dawns that there have been in the course of the story. And actually, it was quite a long time before I actually told anyone about that. I only mentioned it publicly on the 7th of July, and yet this meeting was in the middle of March.
Mm-hmm.
So I sat on that for a while, having learnt my lesson from the December promise of the 4 SERPO photographs, including one of them playing football or something like that, which again was enough to get a lot of people laughing, which, even though it was true, is kind of unfortunate from a public relations point of view. I mean, it's a bit like the strawberry ice cream thing, which some of your listeners may know about. Even if it's true, it's a bit of a pity because it kind of turns it into a bit of a music hall joke, and maybe inappropriately for the serious content, but who knows, And so what I was saying there was that I'd learnt my lesson from that, and so I sat tight on this information until I thought, in the beginning of July, I really thought the whole story was over. I thought, well, I don't know what's going to happen now, but probably nothing, and therefore I might as well tell this story, because it would be a great shame if nobody knew,
Yeah. Now, were you tempted just to grab the pictures and run right out of the room?
Well, yeah, I mean, it would have been a wonderful thing to hang on to. And, of course, you have a whole kind of Keystone Cops cartoon image. You see them running down the street with all these intelligence officers following me, trying to get this photograph back of me.
Yeah.
I don't think I got very far. But
that's probably why the intelligence sources aren't contacting me, I think.
You see, in such a situation, and it's very interesting, you see, because you never know what your own response is going to be until you find yourself in a situation like that.
Yeah.
Whether one's going to be defiant or challenging or, compliant or what.
Yeah.
My instinct, I found at the time, was to cooperate fully because there was the promise of much more to come.
Yeah.
And so my every instinct, was to be very polite and courteous and to say, yes, sir, absolutely. And that's basically what I did.
Yeah.
And if I knew then what I knew now, which was that many months later, those photographs had not been released and there's no sign of them at all. And my $10 worth would be that I don't think we're ever going to see them, to be quite frank. This is that's my leaning, is that I really think that these are not going to appear. I would have been a lot more feisty in that meeting. I would have been a lot more argumentative about why I couldn't take them away and post them immediately.
Yeah.
I just thought, it's because he said, that he had at least a couple of dozen that he could let me have within a couple of weeks and all this kind of stuff. And so, I was as meek as a puppy dog, and I said, well, yes, thank you very much, sir.
Of course, yeah. I see where you come from. You got to play ball at first to see if you can get some more stuff. Now you kind of regret it because they didn't play ball with you.
That's right. And for all I know, that was just maybe another little experiment to see how I would respond. I have absolutely no idea. But one of the features of the story, which I'm sure you're going to want to go on and talk about, is how there have been twists and turns all the way through. And a little earlier on, we were talking about how it looks as if this is not just coming from one isolated source, it's coming from a group of people. And anyone who's worked with groups, either, in business or in the military or in any other environment, knows that groups can be subject to different influences, to different leaders coming forward, maybe to differences of opinion, possibly strong differences of opinion in the group itself. And there's every suggestion that whoever is behind all this has been changing their mind periodically. And that's probably something you want to go onto if you're talking about the timeline. About
that's exactly, yeah. I was just going to say that segues perfectly into the 12/21/2005 message. That represents a sea change in the SERPO story, if you will. It's the last message received, the last message sent to Victor Martinez from Anonymous until March 28th, 2006. At that point, you, Bill Ryan, become the conduit for the anonymous messages 12 through 16, ranging from January through March, late March.
Go
ahead.
Yeah. What's important to clarify there is that there wasn't a sudden handshake and changeover on the 21st of December, or at least, let's say a little while after the 21st of December, when it started to go mighty quiet. Everyone then thought that the whole thing had stopped. I had always thought of the possibility of something coming directly to myself, but no one had ever mentioned it to me. And by the time we got into the second half of January, we all thought that the whole thing had dried up and that was it. And then I was astonished when, and I must say delighted as well. Not delighted in an egoistic way, but delighted because it wasn't all over. And of course, I was still thinking of photographs and all this kind of stuff then. Yeah. This was only about 5 weeks after the promise on the 8th of December, which you just referred to.
Yeah.
But what was interesting there, you see, a lot of people have made reference to an apparent changing of the guard. And I made a reference to that possibility when we were talking about the different sort of ways that the winds may blow in something like this that's being basically orchestrated by a committee, or possibly by, different imperatives coming from different intelligence agency interests, or things like that we can only really imagine.
Yeah.
It occurred to me only a relatively short while ago that one reason for this, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, Victor, throughout his postings up until the 21st of December, had been editing the information so that it was presented in an optimum way. He would cut and paste, and he would insert good punctuation and correct the spelling mistakes, and sometimes collect a whole bunch of anonymous messages and then put them all together into one presentation, exactly as a newspaper writer would be, a newspaper editor would do.
Yeah, and that references back. And that references back to where he says that 85% is from one person, 15% from another, that kind of thing, right?
Absolutely. What he'd do is he would blend it all in together so that it was a readable, presentable story.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of people who appreciated it, because when I started to receive the information, I was told not to change anything. You see, and this was a change in style, because Victor had said to me, he said, it's astonishing that you were told not to change anything, because I was always congratulated for making such a good job of presenting it. And so there was an indication that I was talking to a different person.
Yeah.
One reason for this might well have been that the information which I found myself getting, I think at least in the first 3/4 of the material which I got, were the so-called team commander's logs.
Exactly, yeah.
And the team commander's logs are highly contentious in themselves because of the way that they're presented. But I was explicitly told, don't change a thing. Don't change a single spelling mistake. Don't, it was even acknowledged that there were errors there. In other words, don't correct any of the errors. Just present it exactly as it is. And that's what I did. Whereas I believe that Victor could not have, I don't think he could have tolerated leaving it alone. I think that he could, there's almost a compulsion that he had to put it into a presentable form.
Yeah.
And it may well be that because I had previously stated in the public domain that I thought that Victor shouldn't be editing his material. I didn't say this in a critical way. It was just all part of the debate. I was fully supportive of Victor, and we've worked very closely together. But everybody knew that I did have this difference in view. And it could well have been that for these particular team commanders' logs, they said, well, look, don't give them to Victor because he's going to chew them around. Give them to Bill Ryan because he's going to just post them exactly as we say because he's obedient and he's a reporter and he's not an editor.
Yeah.
And that's what I did. I have to tell you that every now and then during that period, I got something and I thought, oh my goodness, I don't want to post this. This is, this is embarrassing. I don't want to post this.
Yeah.
This is not helping the story. And I was just driven by my commitment that I would present whatever I was given, because I'm just the messenger. But there were some messages that I didn't appreciate getting. And every time I was hoping for something great, for something really dramatic that would turn around all the naysayers. And actually all I got was more ammunition to be thrown against me.
Yeah.
So, and what was interesting there, you see, was that after that there was a hiatus as well. There's another gap, which happened, I think, round about March. And then, again, we all thought it was all over. And then suddenly Victor started getting it again. And on the beginning of April, I think it was, you may know better than me, he got this equipment list, which was sent to him out of the blue. And, of course, he was completely delighted to receive this again. And I thought, okay, that was my few minutes on stage.
Yeah.
And I haven't heard a word from anybody since, and that's it.
Okay. We'll move ahead to April in a moment. Let's fine-tune this period here, because I think it's critical to the SERPO story.
Yep.
Not only is there a changing of the guard as far as who receives the information, but as you said, there's a changing of the style. It's no longer anonymous answering questions and making statements. It's now moved over to a first-person perspective, ostensibly taken from the team commander's journals as he was leaving and going to SERPO.
Yes, that's correct. And they're very weird journals. Anyone who has read them will immediately observe that no one writes a journal like that. No one writes a diary entry saying, well, now I'm doing this, and now I'm doing this, and now I'm doing this, and now I'm doing this. They pick out the key events from the day, and it's usually at the end of the day, and they're usually pretty tired, and they usually write these things in abbreviated form. And the big clue presented itself to me in one of the entries. I can't remember which one it is. But it was when I noticed that there were a number of words which were spelt phonetically incorrectly, meaning, and a perfect example of that was when the word hostile was used, as in the sense of, and I can't remember the exact quote, but it was something like, one of the Ebens might be hostile, or not hostile, or something like that, meaning Hostile, and it was spelled Hostel. And there was another example which was even more dramatic than that, which I can't quite remember as I speak. But then it occurred to me that these were transcripts. These were audio transcripts, and some typist who wasn't even following what he or she was transcribing this stuff from an audio tape. And then I thought, right, these are audio tapes. And I thought, well, if these are audio tapes, what are they audio tapes of? And then I realized that what they could have been was they could have been hypnosis sessions after the team returned back to the Earth for extensive debriefing. And that's how come the whole thing read like a kind of stream of consciousness. Because when one's recalling something under hypnosis, one is always reporting what one's experiencing as if it's happening now. And if all of that was being recorded, the hypnotist's comments and questions were being taken out, and then the whole thing was transcribed. So it was like an intermediate level transcript before the whole thing was cleaned up, ready for some official report. Mm-hmm. And that's what I really do believe I was dealing with. And but it doesn't make good reading. It really does.
And when you're dealing with a story like this, you have to be very, very careful. Did you, obviously you must have talked with Victor Martinez to compare the email addresses, or how are you sure that the anonymous who was sending you the information was the same anonymous from the get-go, or, within the same organization and not some hoaxer who just wanted to stir the pot?
Well, I wasn't getting that information by email, you see, and so I didn't have any email addresses to compare. I was getting that information because it was being uploaded to the server directly. You see. And how this had happened was that back in early December, Victor and I had got ourselves together on the phone because he was worried about receiving these photographs, saying that his web TV wouldn't allow him to receive large images and all of this kind of stuff. So I said, look, I've got a smart idea here. Why don't you give him the FTP details? And for some of your listeners who might not understand that, those are like the passwords for uploading information to the website, to the web server. It's a little bit like a safe deposit box. It's like you give them the code to the safe deposit box, and then I look in the morning with the same code, and I look in there, and it's like, oh, look, there's a whole bunch of photographs. Yeah. And I thought that this was a smart idea. It would give the whoever wanted to put the information there full anonymity. Victor thought it was a smart idea as well. And then that's how I got the information later. Okay, and this policy wasn't like publicly announced on the list or anything like that. Victor wasn't like, we've given up the FTP thing so this guy can put the pictures up. So nobody knew that you were expecting someone to put things on the website except for Victor and whoever was behind the SERPO story, right? I didn't want any smart Alex hacking into the server to try and get photographs or to try and put false photographs there or anything like that. I just thought the fewer people who knew about this, the better. Okay, yeah. I only came clean about that much later when it became apparent that, when I felt it became apparent that the photographs weren't going to arrive, and B, that a lot of people had been asking me exactly the same question as you have asked me about this business of comparing the IP addresses. Because that's been a whole bone of contention, as anyone following the story closely will know, because some people say that the IP address, that the header information of the very first email, which is the only one that Victor kept, the very first one that he received back on the 1st of November, and matched with Rick Doty's IP address. Yeah, that was the next question I was going to ask you. Can you talk about that entire saga that went on in January when this story sort of started coming around? Sure. And I was aware that the IP addresses matched because Victor had shared that with me at an early stage, and I was very alarmed at first. And then I started to look at this rather more carefully than just at first glance, and I found out a number of different things. One of which was I had the opportunity to talk with Rick personally at length. He was at the Laughlin conference where I first met him, which was in March of this year. And subsequently in May, he came to visit myself and Kerry Cassidy at our house for 2.5 hours, and we talked to him at length in person. And he was a very frustrated man at that point. He said, if I was releasing this information, and if I had anything to do with the release of this information, he said it would have been a class act. He said the whole thing has been bungled from beginning to end. He said I have made recommendations, and I have known who to make recommendations to, but they haven't followed my advice. And if he was faking the frustration which he was showing, he deserves an Oscar. I mean, he really wanted this release to work in as much as he was some small part of what was going on in the background. I don't know what role he did play. He made it very clear that he didn't have any kind of a decision-making role. He didn't have any kind of an executive role, and he was just in the mix somewhere along the line in as much as he knew what was happening. Yeah. And what I feel is far more likely is that given Rick's own known history, known to many ufologists, he's infamous because of the Paul Benowitz episode back in 1980. And he's kind of got that blood on his hands and it won't wash off. Mm-hmm. And in some ways, I kind of think it's a shame, because I spoke to Rick about this at great length. And he said, look, I was doing my job. He said, there were a whole number of other people involved with me in AFOSI. We were all doing the same thing. He said, I was the one who got caught in public, and I'm the witch who's been burnt at the stake. He said, nobody else. He said, everyone else has got away with it. None of the other names are known. He said, it was just me who's been made a scapegoat for all of this. And he says, that he was just a young officer. He was doing his job. It would have been outrageous for him to have said, when he was working as an officer in intelligence, for him to say, no, actually, I'm not going to do that. I mean, that's not the kind of thing you do in the Air Force. You don't suddenly disobey an order when you're about 25 years old or something. Yeah. And so, however, perception is everything. And Rick has been kind of tarred ever since with the brush of being a disinformant in the UFO community. Mm-hmm. And there are other things that happen after that to do with the MJ-12 documents and Linda Howe and stuff, which I confess I don't know an awful lot about, but my understanding is, again, he was, this was still in the same time frame in the early 1980s, and he was still operating very much under orders. Now, given that he's got that history, it would make sense for the powers that be to insert Rick's details into that initial anonymous email to make sure that there was a kind of fuse in the circuit, that there was the plausible deniability in the story, so that if anything went wrong with the story, if it backfired, if it wasn't accepted, if it was disbelieved, if it didn't go down well, then they would maybe do exactly as a lot of people have been saying, oh, wait a minute, this is a whole load of baloney because it all came from Rick Doty's IP address. Okay, case closed. What a beautiful escape for the powers that be if the story didn't go down well, for them to put Rick Doty right in there at the very beginning. Yeah. And I spoke to with Kit Green, who has had extensive experience with the CIA. He works at still quite a deep level in the intelligence community. This is Christopher Green, for those people who may not recognize his name. If you look him up in Google, he was the guy who was running the so-called Weird Desk at the CIA, and he was responsible for briefing President Clinton on UFOs and stuff. And so he knows what he's doing. And I met him, and I know him, and he told me, he said that he met somebody who showed him how you could spoof an entire email header within 30 seconds, and he did it in front of his eyes. Yeah. Now, just because you and I can't do that, it doesn't mean to say it can't be done. Yeah. I would have thought that that if you're going to work for the CIA or the NSA or any one of those other alphabet agencies, learning how to spoof internet headers is probably an intelligence 101. It must be one of the first things you learn how to do. Yeah. And so there's every reason to believe, or every reason to suspect, in my opinion, that this was, this wasn't anything to do with Doty at the start. He's kind of got dragged into it, and he's been used as a way to discredit the story. Now, let me present the other side as well, just in case anyone accuses me of being too partial. Go for it. Some people have said, well, why on earth was Victor Martinez chosen for this job? Now, one answer on one end of the credibility spectrum is to say, well, actually, he had this ready-made specialist audience of these 130 people, which I've already mentioned a little earlier on. And that could have all, and that was actually quite a good little sort of focus group, a control group to judge the response of an important release of information. And he could have been chosen for that reason. The skeptics on the other end of the spectrum will say, well, Victor was chosen because he's got web TV and he hasn't got the means to trace down IP addresses, and he's not a sophisticated computer user, and therefore it's very easy to pull the wool over his eyes. And some people have said that. And that's the other side of the argument.
Yeah.
I don't think that is the case. I could be wrong. And 11 and a half months on, as we've been saying, as we've been talking, nobody actually can prove a thing. I can't prove I've seen the photographs. No one can prove that was Rick who sent that first message.
Yeah.
Nobody even knows for sure who it was who actually sent it. And we've got kind of weird anomalies, like the fact that there's this guy, this elderly man with the CIA connections, whose ancestors contain the name Sylvester and McCoglin. But then, because I haven't released the name, somebody would say, well, how is it possible even to believe that? And so the story drags on.
Yeah, exactly. Now, that Paul Benowitz story is really kind of a cautionary tale. As you were getting into this SERPO story, were you starting to get a little worried maybe that you were going to end up as Paul Benowitz Y2K or something? Paul Benowitz 2.0, if you will.
No, I had no thoughts that I was going to be driven into madness and despair. This was not, that didn't enter my mind. I did think earlier on this year, when I first realized that Rick's IP address seemed to be the same as the address which the initial information was coming from, I thought, oh boy, I wonder if this whole thing is just a complete load of hokum. And I subsequently satisfied myself that this wasn't the case, primarily from having the opportunity to spend quite a lot of time with Rick himself. Now, I do understand what this looks like from the outside, because very, very few of your listeners will have had the opportunity to do the same thing. But Rick's a nice guy. He's, I wouldn't mind being stuck on a desert island with him. He's a lot of fun. And if he was, if he has been lying to me, he really deserves an Oscar. And I know a lot of other people who know him to say no. Look, come on, Rick's really got nothing to do with this whatsoever. He's just being made he's being made the fall guy. He's being made the patsy for all of this.
Yeah.
And one of the frustrating things about this entire story is that because there's no substantive evidence to prove anything either way, it's become a war of words, and it's become a war of feelings. Mm-hmm. And so this has been debated very aggressively on the internet. I would even go to say very unpleasantly. And
I'm sure
I would put a lot of my personal money on the fact that that pot has been stirred by factions within the intelligence community who do not want this story to get out. And they have been capitalizing on all the weaknesses of the story and all of the weaknesses of the story behind the story in order to rubbish it as much as they possibly can do. And I'm pretty convinced that one of the things that's going on here is that there's a CIA faction that is trying to undermine what looks to be a DIA faction's positive work, and things are very complicated behind the scenes. But I can't prove that either.
Yeah. Okay, moving along in the chronology here of the SERPO story. It's late January 2006. This is probably one of the few specific postings that I'm going to reference the text of, kind of, and that is because there's an even more interesting sea change in the portrayal of the Evens. In this journal entry that's posted on the 28th of January, it details a dispute between the humans who have landed on SERPO and the Evens, and up until then, for the previous 3 months, the Evens were this happy-go-lucky crew, and now they're doing some kind of biological experiment on one of the deceased humans on SERPO. Talk about that sort of change in the portrayal of the Evens, and what do you think that means in the big picture?
Yeah, good point. Okay. Well, I have no idea whether that is true or false, but that's one of the stories that I didn't want to post. I mean, I thought, God, what are people going to think? This is a complete reversal in the picture that had been painted, just as you mentioned. Mm-hmm. And I checked with Victor Martinez, and Victor then told me that he had this this cloning. Well, no, actually, let me back up on that because there's a twist to that story. I had another anonymous email, through the SERPO website contact form back in December, saying, "There's more to this story than meets the eye. One of the crew members died en route and was cloned." And that actually went into some technical detail about the cloning that I ran past Kit Green, who is a neurosurgeon at Wayne Medical University. Wow. And he said, this rings true. This was written by somebody who knew a few medical words and who used them correctly. This was not invented by a kid. Victor took this message, ran it past his anonymous source, and his anonymous source get back to him saying, yes, this is what happened, but don't mention it to anybody. Yeah. Because this story must never get out. Uh-oh. And so Victor did as he was told, and I did as I was told. And then suddenly in January, this story that Victor was told in December must not get out was suddenly being told in all its gory glory, Yeah. And that was more evidence for somebody new at the steering wheel who was making different kinds of decisions about what information should be released. Yeah. Now, it also indicates, and here we're just all guessing together, that maybe initially the sort of planned storyline was that the Ebens would be presented as a sort of friendly and harmless and, docile and unthreatening and, kind of goofy, Yeah. And in other words, just keep it to that and don't mention the more sinister side of things. Mm-hmm. And then suddenly there was another policy or strategy that seemed to be being rolled out after the gap of 6 to 8 weeks or something like that. It says, okay, let's tell it as it is. Actually, these Ebens aren't as friendly, as unthreatening as we thought. They've actually got a lot of high-tech capability. They may seem to have some endearing kind of quasi-human characteristics, but actually they work in a completely alien way because they were dismembering this dead team member's body and cloning it and doing all kinds of horrific things and weren't even thinking twice about it. Yeah. And didn't even understand why the team was getting so upset. And so, that really is a sort of creepy, chilling depiction of a possible alien worldview. It's like, well, of course, look at it's like I can do anything I like with this body. It's dead. What are you worried about? Yeah. Which is not a human way of looking at things, and which is rather chilling. It's the kind of thing you find in a horror film. And then, of course, after that, just as we were kind of braced to expect more, then suddenly that all went quiet. And then after that, it sort of all went docile again, and there were just some few bits and pieces, and everything's kind of tailed out. And as we were mentioning a little while ago, we just don't know whether there's going to be any more. Yeah. And whether we'll ever know the answers to this.
To continue on sort of the storyline here, then after that, in February, all that was received was a strange diagram. I'm not positive yet what it was, either the power system or a ship itself. And
it was a sundial. Apparently, later on, Victor received confirmation that this weird diagram that was labeled just as Eben object was the sundial, which was a sort of one of the core components of the story, because this is the way that this high-tech race measured their time, which, of course, is another thing that made a lot of people walk away from the story because they couldn't see how that could possibly be the case. And that was contentious, and I know exactly what you're going to say, because somebody who was very smart and very accurate discovered that it came from an architect's drawing stencil, and they went so far as to specify the exact drawing stencil, and there's absolutely no doubt that they're correct. This is exactly what it was. But even that was not enough to sink the story, because then if you go back to how long that drawing stencil had been around for, it'd been around since the early 1960s, and in their 45 tons of stuff, they may well have taken a drawing stencil with them.
Exactly.
And Victor Martinez said, because by now the ball was back in his court again. He said that he checked it out with the anonymous source, and he was told that, this is one of the things they took with him, and this was drawn by the team commander when he was sitting looking at this sundial, which is a slightly complicated, fairly small object. And he wasn't a very good draftsman, and so he used this drawing stencil.
Exactly, yeah.
Is that true? I haven't got a clue.
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to cover that part as we sort of head throughout the year of SERPO. And then the next big event in the SERPO story, of course, is in March when released was sort of how would I describe it? The SERPO, the even language, I guess. I'm not even sure how it was written. It was just sort of a block of strange symbols.
Yep.
Talk a little bit about that posting.
Well, there's nothing really to say. One of the things that has surfaced periodically in ufology, as far as I'm aware, is the whole idea of alien language.
Yeah.
And a little while ago, I was contacted by somebody in Norway who gave me his samples of the alien written language that he said he had received through automatic writing. Then there's the script that is supposed to have been seen on the I-beams in the wreckage of the Roswell craft, and then there are various other contactees who have had samples of alien writing in various books that have been published, and none of it matches with anything else.
Oh, really?
It's all different. Huh. Now, that doesn't mean anything in particular, because if you look on our own planet, we've got English, and the English script, I should say the Roman script as it is. We've got Arabic, we've got Cyrillic, we've got Thai, we've got Chinese, we've got Japanese, and we've got probably several dozen other forms of script which I can't even name.
I'm sure.
That doesn't mean that that it's all bogus. And if we're dealing with a number of different alien species, it's entirely plausible or even to be expected that the script would be different. I think some people have tried to analyze this sample of script. I don't think anyone's made anything of it. It's another just piece of it's a bit of standalone evidence. It doesn't mean anything. Yeah. Because the critics will just say, well, of course, this is the kind of thing that could have been produced by a monkey. It doesn't mean a damn thing because you don't know what it means. You don't know what the characters represent. You haven't got any kind of translator. You haven't got anything. You don't know whether it's instructions how to create element 115 or whether it's a shopping list. You've got no idea what this thing is. Yeah. And so as a standalone snippet of information, it doesn't correlate or triangulate with anything else in the SERPO story. And it's one of the things, that made Rick Doty say, in his own words, that if he'd been managing this release, it would have been a class act. It's almost as if whoever's been behind this release has kind of reached blind into some kind of a grab bag and just, produced whatever it was that they happened to find in their hands. Yeah. There doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason to it. There doesn't seem to be any sequence, any connection between the various releases. And yet, although that's incredibly frustrating for you and for me and for just about everybody else, it does invite the question, of, well, if this was a carefully crafted hoax coming from the intelligence community with a lot of thought and money and experience behind it, they would have made a much better job of it. And it just looks like a mess.
That does it for this week's edition of Binnall of America Audio. Big thanks to Bill Ryan for coming on the show. We're going to continue our conversation on Project SERPO next week as we explore the tumultuous final months of the story and discuss the whole big picture of SERPO. You can find out more information on Bill Ryan at the following websites: www.serpo.org or www.projectcamelot.org. Moving right along now, it's time for Binnall of America Audio listener feedback. And we have this week perhaps one of the most hilarious emails I've ever received. The subject line is Lance/Hitler/Himmler And the email comes from Anonymous. Here's what Anonymous had to say. I think you should be ashamed of yourself for putting such trash on the internet. At least you're not charging anyone for it, I suppose. Don't you think in a world where there are so many serious issues facing us, you could use your show to actually enlighten people rather than flinging this esoteric mud in their faces? Your contempt for your fellow human beings absolutely amazes me. I can only assume you're doing this as some far right-wing plot to undermine civic values by turning people into idiots. This comes from Anonymous. I really don't even know where to begin on this one, Anonymous, but for starters, I'm going to have to assume that you're writing to us about the Jerry E. Smith episode of Binnall of America Audio last season that covered the Holy Lance, also known as the Spear of Destiny, thus the title Lance/Hitler/Himmler, because there was additional discussion on Hitler and Nazi Antarctic bases and what have you. So I presume that's what you're writing to us about, Anonymous, and by that token, I guess you are at least 10 months behind the rest of the Binnall of America Audio listening audience, so you really need to get with it. You're really behind the times here, Anonymous. Following that little clarification, yes, you are correct. We are not charging anyone for it, but of course we do take donations, so if you're not enraged by our content, feel free to donate and help us keep putting this trash on the internet. Unfortunately, Anonymous, you really don't offer me any guest suggestions or topic suggestions that I could use to actually enlighten people, as you say. So I suppose I'm going to have to continue flinging the esoteric mud. You are incorrect that I have contempt for my fellow human beings, although I will say I am slightly disappointed with the human race in general. But that does not extend, of course, to the Binnall of America Audio listeners. They have done their homework, they're looking for answers, just like I am, so I consider them exemplary human beings. And finally, unfortunately, I have to burst your bubble here. I am not a part of a far right-wing plot to undermine civic values, nor, unfortunately, am I a part of a far left-wing plot to undermine civic values. I am doing this all as a part of a quest for answers in the esoteric world, and not at the behest of any sinister organization. Hopefully that clears up some of your concerns, Anonymous. Thank you for making my day, my week, and possibly my month with your hilarious email. If you have a question, comment, thoughts on a previous episode, or a guest suggestion, feel free to click the contact button at binnallofamerica.com. It's in the top right-hand corner. That will put you well on the way to getting your email read here on Binnall of America Audio Listener Feedback. And, of course, you can always send it to boaaudio@hotmail.com. Wrapping up the program, I want to thank Leslie, Chiron, R. Lee, Joe V., and Ralph Molesworth of binnallofamerica.com for your help and support with the audio series and the website. If you're only listening to Binnall of America Audio and you're not checking out the reading material at binnallofamerica.com, you're only getting half the story. binnallofamerica.com, make it a part of your everyday search for esoteric news and opinion. If you're a long-time Binnall of America Audio listener, an appreciative newcomer, or you're just simply full of holiday cheer, and you want to make a donation to help keep the audio series up and running, click the PayPal button at binnallofamerica.com, make a donation. Every little bit helps, and all donations go towards paying for Binnall of America Audio and making sure that the show is free and available to all of our great listeners. Next week on Binnall of America Audio, we wrap it up with Bill Ryan. We're talking about the rest of the SERPO story, how it all panned out through 2006, big picture analysis of the SERPO story, what it all might mean. And in addition to that, Bill brings in his partner, Carrie Cassidy, for a lengthy discussion on their new endeavor, Project Camelot, which is an internet video interview series that you can find at projectcamelot.org. We're going to talk about how they find their guests, how they guard against potential hoaxers, the overall goals of Project Camelot, and how it all came about. It's the first time ever we've had two guests on at the same time, so definitely tune in for that historic edition of Binnall of America Audio. And with that, we wrap up another edition of Binnall of America Audio. Thank you very much for listening, folks. You'll be hearing from me next week. Until then, this is Tim Binnall, signing off.